Well, welcome to everybody who has joined us from the Dartmouth Alumni Association of Silicon Valley. We're very excited to have you here today for our third in-depth conversation in our sustainability series, in which we talk with people innovating to protect the health of our environment. I'm Kate Sackman Roski and one of your hosts today. Unfortunately, Carrie Rosenow is ill today and can't join us, so I'm delighted to be talking with our sole guest today, Daniel Hamilton. He's the Sustainability Director for the city of Oakland, California, a city which is highly respected for its holistic methodology, connecting all its sustainability efforts to solving human problems. With us today also is Catherine Laurie, President of the Dartmouth Alumni Association of Silicon Valley, and Kevin Jiang, a fellow member of the DAASC board. So our format today will include a short introductory presentation by Daniel, followed by a discussion with him about Oakland's sustainability leadership and commitments, including efforts around water, waste, and transportation. Daniel earned his BA in architecture and master in urban planning and sustainable development from the University of Kansas. He has 25 years experience in managing sustainability programs, policies, and plans for local governments and utilities. He has created and managed internationally recognized energy and climate programs. He represented Oakland at the UN COP21 climate conference in Paris and leads one of the most ambitious municipal sustainability programs in the world. He also has taught professional and university courses in energy management, sustainable policy development, and green building design and construction. So we have a little bit of housekeeping before we get going. Everybody should know that this event is being recorded so that we can share it with those who couldn't be here today. If you're okay with that, please stick with us. We're together today for an hour and we'll save 15 minutes for audience questions at the end. Please submit your questions in the chat and provide your name. Kevin will be reviewing the questions and will ask you we'll ask your question to Daniel if at the end of the talk. Other than that, the audience will be muted for this event. Please remain muted the whole time. And Daniel, take it away.
Thank you so much, Kate. Glad to be here. I think based on that introduction, you probably heard that Oakland, California, the east side of the Bay, has been doing a lot in the 8 years that I've been here with the city towards developing a pretty comprehensive climate strategy. And what I hope I can help share with you today is how Oakland is using an equity-based strategy to sort of redefine what it is that climate goals look like. Traditionally, greenhouse gas reductions have been the basis for this, but you're going to hear a little bit different version of that today. When you ask the questions first of what are the historic inequities that exist within a community, who are the disproportionately impacted people, not only as a result of climate change, but as a result of the decisions that have been made, particularly by local governments, for where infrastructure and other critical pieces of urban form are placed. And how can we use climate solutions to help address those historic inequities in ways that bring about a much more equal society? So that's the context for what we're going to talk about today, and I hope to be able to share where that's going well in Oakland, where there are some struggles with that approach, and what some of these efforts look like, where we definitely are lacking in some success and need new ideas and new thinking. Okay, so to start with, on the screen, you are seeing here Mayor Libby Schaaf. Mayor Schaaf is in her final months here as Oakland mayor after a good solid 7.5 years of leading the city. We are all very sad to see her go. This is her presenting on the US national stage at COP21 in Paris. And for those of you who've had the good pleasure to meet Mayor Schaaf and see this, this was really her introduction to the world of climate change. And in Paris at this conference, this is where the big international agreements were set to keep things below 2 degrees Celsius globally, where the big commitments came for all of us to work together within this. One of the first things that she asked within that is, That's all well and good that we can help solve the climate crisis and we can do our part. But what does life look like for an Oaklander, especially an Oaklander who's faced disadvantage in the past? What does this world look like for them? How is it different than the inequities that they face today? How is it that we can do this in a way that not just saves the environment, but makes our cities more livable, more affordable, things that people can relate to every day in their lives? And my response to this, and this very much supports sort of the city's broad strategy around this, is to think of cities like Oakland as entrepreneurial bureaucrats. That is a mouthful and an expression I am quite sure none of you have ever heard applied before, because entrepreneurial is not an adjective typically applied to bureaucrats. In fact, it's the exact opposite. Federal governments, and to a lesser extent state governments, tend to be very, very slow by nature. And it's usually because they're dealing with what are the worst possible outcomes of policies and ideas and then basing action around that. Cities have a unique perspective in that they have the ability to move faster than any other form of government. And often the test ideas that happen in cities, whether they're about innovation, whether they're just about new ideas, cities are the place where we can find out what works and what doesn't. I'm going to give you some examples of where this is happening already within climate change and how some of these things have scaled up. The things happen across California cities that go to the state government, state to the federal government, or things that are happening in California cities like Oakland that are spreading to other states, where cities are also taking a leadership role in their regions. So there's a lot of opportunity. That's how we see ourselves in cities. The type of analysis we do doesn't typically work in the private sector, but for governments, it has the potential to work at a lot of scale. And this is what I hope to be able to help share with you today. So just to give you a sense of where Oakland is at on this, about 30% emission reductions between our baseline year of 2005 and 2019. Within that, this is good progress by city standards, for sure. Not many cities have reached a level like this. And it's caused by a variety of factors that I'm going to get into a little bit here. We have more than 350 climate-focused companies headquartered or with major offices within Oakland, more than 7,000 people employed in the local green economy. And those are just the ones we can track. There are often a lot of climate jobs that go beyond this that we're not able to get. And typically we have among the lowest per capita greenhouse gases anywhere in the country. Now, part of that is a function of having the great climate that we have here in the Bay Area. The Mediterranean climate doesn't require a whole lot of air conditioning and doesn't have very harsh seasons on either end. But it also is a function of very early adoption for things like electric vehicles and clean energy and a variety of things that that the Bay Area as a whole does really well in. And Oakland, I think, is a good representative example of that. But similar to what I started with on the equity strategy, within those, rarely do I bring forward recommendations to my mayor or my council around reducing greenhouse gas emissions. Those are usually the byproduct of things like improving local and air quality, or creating more living wage jobs, or reducing the energy cost burden for people so they can stay rooted within their homes. Displacement and gentrification are among the primary concerns, as well as a massive homelessness and housing crisis within Oakland. Finding ways to get climate-friendly solutions to building more housing, improving our air quality, creating jobs, lowering electricity bills. These are the things that really drive the type of work that we do in a city like Oakland. So one of the ways we've based this strategy is something that I think really will give you an idea of what works within city governments and what doesn't. So what you see in front of you, and I apologize, you really don't need to read all of this. That's just sort of a reference for later if you want. Most cities base their greenhouse gas strategies on just going after the sectors that we know are big at a national scale. So things like transportation and land use and building energy use. These are the main sectors that we try to address. But what that means at the local level is something that is rarely understood. In fact, one of the things that the mayor asked me back in 2015 was, okay, so specifically, where are most of the emissions coming from in Oakland, and where do we have the most cost-effective path to reducing them? My answer was, I don't really know. I know generally where the emissions are, but I have really bad data sets. Our transportation data all comes from modeling and doesn't take into account a lot of local considerations of which vehicles are actually on the road at any given time. They're more about where the vehicle is registered rather than where it's driven. Same thing on energy use. From there, it captures a lot of the energy that's used, but not a lot in the industrial sector. Doesn't include the airplanes that fly out of Oakland's airport, or the ships that come in the fifth largest container port in the United States, which is also located in Oakland. Really imperfect data. So Oakland set out between 2016 and 2018 to develop the first local government cost abatement model for climate change anywhere in the Western Hemisphere. And we produced this with Bloomberg Associates. It gave us this deep dive look at, here's exactly how much it's going to cost to do these changes over time. Here are the sectors where the technology is caught up. Here are the ways we can do this integrated over time, looking at specific standards for water heating or space heating or electrifying heavy duty vehicles versus passenger vehicles. These type of questions had never been answered at the city scale before. And cities around the country and around Central and South America marveled at this report. This was the government response. And then I showed it to sustainability folks who worked for Google or Nike or Facebook. And they looked at this and they said, how on earth did you not know that? They assumed that everybody had better information than they did. And we sat there with them and had to explain why this was the most cutting edge thing in government. And they looked at it as very pedestrian elementary level data on which to make decisions. And I think it gives you a better understanding of just what cities and states and nations deal with in terms of making these climate policies. It's really based on much more limited information than private companies tend to have. So Oakland has tried to lead the way. We actually shared this model for free with any government who wanted to use it. And there are now dozens of versions of this around that we're thankful to have helped piloted. So I mentioned that there are a couple of key areas that we're really trying to tackle, and this is no different from any other city. Sustainable transportation. Transportation is about 2/3 of the emissions that you see anywhere. And transportation is not just the source of greenhouse gas emissions, it's also the source of poor air quality, poor health outcomes, specifically around things like nitrogen oxides, sulfur oxides that come out of a lot of airport and ship emissions, which we have here in Oakland, and also particulate matter, specifically diesel particulate matter where you have heavy truck use. So within that, people tend to think about electric vehicles as the solution to those things, but often electric vehicles are only getting at the passenger market, which is a very tiny portion of what's actually causing all that bad air quality, all those health outcomes that we talked about earlier. So within this, it's just giving you a list of just some of the many ways that cities like Oakland start to tackle this stuff. We require electric vehicle infrastructure for all new development, regardless of type. So whether you're building a commercial business or a single family home, you have to put in EV charging equipment. We have e-scooters and e-bikes, car share vehicles. We have about 155 new bike lane miles just in the last 4 years that we've built within Oakland. We no longer use fossil fuel-based diesel anywhere in the city's fleet. Those are the buses that you see below. There, the green bus runs on hydrogen fuel cell. So we have a mix of hydrogen fuel cell and renewable diesel buses that serve most of the city. And we require things like diesel particulate filters for the big trucks that come in and out of ports, both the airport and the seaport. This is just to give you a sense of the fact that when you're talking about transportation, electric vehicles are nice, but they're a tiny part of the way cities try to tackle some of these issues. And like I said, primarily not from the sake of reducing greenhouse gas emissions, but from trying to get to how do we have cleaner health, both indoor and outdoor, for the people that live in our community. But electric vehicles are still important and people see them on a regular basis. 21% of new car sales in Oakland were some form of plug-in in the beginning of 2022. Down in the South Bay, it's the highest anywhere in the country. Palo Alto peaks about 40%. They are the top city, so you Palo Altans out there, kudos to you. This should tell you nationally, it's about 1%. 1.2% was the national total by that. Half of the electric vehicles in the United States are in California, and half of California's electric vehicles are in the Bay Area. So a full quarter of the EVs that we have on the roads within the United States today are here just in the Bay Area region. So it's a very different sense of that, but we've also built out infrastructure and started to deal with a lot of the problems that other folks are seeing coming down the road. And it really is going to help us not only help other California areas like LA and San Diego, but also help the metro areas on the East Coast and in the middle of the country really help to move forward in more effective ways. And we have a master plan. Cities love to do plans for things. And our city recently completed a plan to help us get to a full phase out of all gasoline powered vehicles, including heavy duty, by 2040, which is a pretty massive undertaking. And I'm happy to dive into the details there for anybody who wants to follow up with a question. But the green economy is probably the biggest area where we see the opportunity to truly make a change on climate change in impacting people's lives. These are just a couple of the many businesses that we have that are focused on this. People like Grid Alternatives and Vote Solar, they help specifically get low income properties having solar and often batteries now on their homes. We have an incubator business called Powerhouse within Oakland, 100% women managed and started, that houses about 30 businesses at a time that are in their startup space and has graduated some fairly large companies in the solar industry space that are working globally to truly help transition things, particularly for frontline communities. It's just been a remarkable story of seeing how many companies are coming up that are trying to tackle the systemic problems of climate change and how they're developing solutions. A lot of these are tech driven and a lot of them are inclusive strategies, new corporate structures that I think are going to be really helpful in shifting the narrative around climate not being something that's just a liberal versus conservative thing, but a way that we can help restructure businesses that account for things like risk management and long-term cost controls and effect on worker health, also in ways that I think businesses have shown an appetite to do, regardless of political persuasion of the people they're serving. And I wanted to finish here on the first part of the presentation with an idea that I said cities can be a test bed for a lot of the creative ideas that are out there in the world. The Oakland Eco Block is one example, so you can sort of get a visceral version of this. This is a neighborhood in the Fruitvale neighborhood of Oakland. It's the central part of the city, largely Latinx populations, but really mixed in age and income, like right on the edge of our frontline communities for air quality within this. UC Berkeley and Lawrence Berkeley National Lab came up with this idea of not retrofitting one home at a time with energy efficient appliances or solar, but what if we did an entire city block at one time? What could we do differently? How would we treat it differently for things like energy storage? Or how might we be able to buy and do contractors at scale in ways that allowed us to maybe do more cost-effective retrofits of homes? So this is under construction right now in Oakland. This entire block that you see will be a zero net energy neighborhood. It will have its own microgrid for when there are power outages, whether they're rolling or whether they're scheduled on there. This entire neighborhood can stay with power on for its people on there, not because of a battery on any one person's home, but because there's a shed that's going to serve all of them with a much bigger battery than you could put in any one person's home. Those are the kind of examples of the technologies that you can deploy at scale that you can't do on an individual home. 50 to 80% water reductions will happen in each of the homes. Water is becoming a huge issue in climate change. And this is a good example of how you can get water storage on site that we can collect off the rooftops and then use for all of the outdoor irrigation so they can eliminate outdoor water use. They'll have shared electric vehicles within the neighborhood, so block level charging as well, and a shared vehicle. So instead of getting a gig car or something for the neighborhood, there will be Nissan Leafs in the neighborhood that residents can check out anytime they want. This is something that other cities in the state of California are looking at for how we look at our existing neighborhoods, because we know that having new homes are built to really high standards right now, and they're not likely to be part of the problem. But the biggest part of the problem is how do we take the existing homes that are here and make them climate friendly for the future. So this is an example of one of the approaches that Oakland is taking. LA has their own version of this. San Francisco's got some creative stuff. Boulder, Colorado. Cities are tackling this in a number of different ways. And not all of these things will work, but I think we'll be able to take lessons from these and apply them forward. So I hope you're getting an idea here that of how this equity first model really looks like. For transportation, this isn't about climate change, this is about health. For retrofitting homes, this is about how you keep people rooted in their homes, lower their electric bills, lower their water use, and help them really stay rooted within their communities in ways that makes climate-friendly solutions much more palatable, much more understandable for people who aren't engaged in the climate sector at all. So these are just a couple of examples of Oakland. From now, I think we'll move into discussion so we can get into more detail on these, but hopefully this gives you a good sense of the starting point.
Wow, Daniel, thank you for that. That is extremely inspiring. There's so much there we could dive into. So why don't we get started? Maybe we'll go backwards from the end of your presentation. I love this whole idea of the eco block. And you said something about refurbishing buildings and building new ones. So is the block a combination of both?
No, in this case, the block are all existing homes. So these are about 80 and 90-year-old buildings that have virtually no insulation in the walls, single pane, metal framed windows within there. These are really difficult homes to retrofit. So the team of Lawrence Berkeley Lab, UC Berkeley, and Stanford were the primary scientists and policy folks really digging into what technologies should we use, how could we deploy these across different blocks. And in our case, in the city, what we said is, well, if you do it for one block, that's great. Be sure to pick a frontline community, which they did, and I described with them that this is a heavily Latinx, low and moderate income neighborhood. But we also said, but part of this is you're going to help us write a guide that says, how do we update our codes? How do we update our approval processes so that any neighborhood can self-organize and replicate this? How do we make sure that they spend less money than this group did when they want to retrofit theirs? And how do we keep on paying it forward in ways that allow more and more neighborhoods to do this? And that's the next phase of this. We already have 5 more neighborhoods lined up to do this next based on the lessons that we learned here. And we've got a lot of other cities that are looking at their own versions of how they take these lessons and apply it to their own codes and processes. But we think we can use this as a result of all the work put in over about 5 years by these teams to really help make it much easier, much cheaper, and much faster for any neighborhood who wants to do this to do it in the future. And they may choose different technologies. They may have different interests, but it's going to still increase their access and their capacity to do what they want in their homes that help make things more climate friendly in the future. Who
pays for it? The homeowners, or is there a fund? How does this work?
In this case, most of this project is paid for by a state agency called the California Energy Commission. They have a research and development fund that specifically looks at new ideas in technologies, in government practices, in transportation, and tries to fund the best ideas. So this retrofit here, even though it's only about 40 buildings within there, it's going to be about $5 million to do the whole thing. So that's the scale of cost we're talking about. The vast majority of that cost went into the researchers actually building the models and creating new codes and doing all of the back end work, then retrofitting the homes. So now we can take that and hand it to everybody who wants to use this in the future so that they won't have to pay any of those costs. We think it can reduce retrofit costs by about 20 to 30%, having all of that up front. And that's one of the things that won't just apply in Oakland because this is paid for by the state. We're making this applicable statewide. So there should be benefit up and down California for the results of this.
That is awesome. Well, California always tends to be on the cutting edge of these kinds of things. So thank God that you're leading the way. You talked about the reuse of water. How is it reused? Are you taking water that's been used inside the house and watering the lawn with it, or is it somehow being refiltered?
You hit the nail right on the head in the first one. Water is cyclical in its use. Nobody ever actually uses water. We only borrow it for a little bit of time, whether we're putting it in our bodies or using it on our lawns or using it in our laundry systems. So we attempt to keep it on property for as much as possible. So it includes rainwater collection. So you collect the rainwater in barrels or in storage facilities underneath homes. Within there, you can turn around and use it for irrigating outside property. You can also use laundry water. For the most part, our dirty laundry water drains directly into the bay, but it doesn't need to. We can absolutely capture that and reuse it on site for outdoor irrigation. Or in some cases, even some of these homes have proposed to do a separate plumbing system in the home where you can reuse recycled water for things like flushing toilets. So there are a variety of ways you can do this, and a few different technologies are tried in this neighborhood. But the idea is the vast majority of residential water use in California is actually from outdoor irrigation. So it's people watering their lawns, watering their plants. This is the area where we have the most potential in cities to help deal with the drought that's been ongoing. And it's one of those areas where I think you're likely to see a huge amount of progress as we simply run out of water in California. We're going to have to get better about how we handle this. And this is, I'll look into some of the ways in which Oakland is trying to lead, but there are a whole lot of really active efforts here that look very different in a place like the Bay Area, where water use is extremely low because we don't have a lot of grass and we don't have very big yards, versus Southern California, where they have both of those things. And it's quite a bit of a different challenge.
Well, that's fantastic. So I want to ask about the Powerhouse Incubator. That sounds pretty exciting. Where do you find the founders?
Oh, I find them wherever I can get them, and I take all of their time possible. So Danny Kennedy was the CEO of Sungevity for a long time. He was the founder of that company. And after that company was successful, Danny decided to use some of the proceeds of starting a profitable company to create the powerhouse. So he did this with a woman named Emily Kirsch, who was at that point working for the Ella Baker Center for Human Rights. And they created this model of incubating climate-friendly businesses. So they created this in Oakland about 13 years ago and bought office space, and they provide free office space, free legal support, free advertising, and free corporate governance for these companies for a period of 12 to 24 months to help them get off the ground, help scale their ideas, partner them with other businesses and potential buyers. And lately, they've focused almost all of their efforts on access to VC. So where Silicon Valley, very well known for its access to VC, but over on this side of the bay, some of these smaller climate companies just have trouble playing in those traditional VC sandboxes. The Powerhouse was designed specifically to help bridge that gap and has done a remarkable amount of fundraising for these companies and spawned some really successful versions like Mosaic, company that helps aggregate individuals who want to invest in solar projects, but you're not a corporate or investor level investor. Excuse me, you're not an institutional level investor within those. Mosaic can help pool those monies together and invest in solar projects around the world with a return rate of 7 to 8%. It's phenomenally successful. They've grown to several hundred employees around the lake, and this is one of many companies that have spawned pretty sustainable business models as a result of this. So it's amazing to see, and the team is very intentional and active about its female leadership. As many of you on the call probably know, clean tech and sustainability is a very male-dominated field. And among the many places where there are gender inequities, this is one where the founders of here had a very intentional strategy to help address that through the nature of the programs. And I think they've done a remarkable job in doing that.
Do the products that result from the incubator end up being applied in Oakland, or do they go after greener pastures?
These are typically national or global scale companies in their range. So rarely do we see specifics in Oakland. We have had projects and companies that stay rooted in Oakland for their headquarters and for their employment bases. But in terms of products, we can point to a few in there, but I think their ambitions go far beyond our sleepy little town of 450,000 in the East Bay.
Yeah. Are there things that you've learned from the EcoBlock project that are, or any of these things that you've described, that are applicable to the average homeowner in, say, California?
I think there's a lot of things to take from this, and this is not an Oakland-specific recommendation here. This is really for anybody in these areas. The focus of the work that cities tend to do is trying to take the structural efforts and make them easier, make them cheaper, to make them more convenient. So an example of this would be your recycling service. Everybody has their recycling can in California because it's mandated by state law in there. It's one can that you put everything in, from newspapers to glass to metal, whatever recyclables that you have within there. That structure was created by cities and eventually implemented at the state level in there to make it simpler and easier for people to recycle. You didn't have to know which products specifically went with which categories, and you didn't have to track these things. You didn't have to watch the recycling markets. And participation rates in recycling went way, way up when we instituted this. So a lot of what you see is cities trying to make it simpler and easier for people to take action within their homes. And I think some of the areas where you're going to see it next, so for the people who want to be leaders in their own homes and get a little bit ahead of where the cities are, water is the biggest area we can act in right now. I mentioned some of the things that define this are the lack of water efficiency outside. A lot of people still use sprinklers to maintain grass within their yards. Quite frankly, there is no place for grass in the future of the modern West. This will be looked at in 30 years as one of the things that people will not be able to understand why we had grass lawns when we were in the middle of drought and people were facing water shortages in their homes on this. So replacing grass turf areas with other low water plants. It's nice if they're pollinators and local as well, native species within there. But if nothing else, installing drip systems within your irrigation areas is an easy way to ensure that you're only watering during times when there's very little evaporation. You can definitely cut down on the bulk of your water use from that in there. And little things on just putting, for instance, for my kids, I put a timer in the shower. The kids love to actually play with it and use the timer It's a simple thing, but they can set it and it's a reminder. So they know if they've been in the shower for 3 minutes or 10 minutes. In the end, those things make a big difference. You can find ways to make these little things fun. My kids have recycling competitions as well in their homes. It's part of their chores for the week that they sort of compete on what it is that they can get into the recycling bin. So there's lots of ways to sort of gamify this and make it more fun and enjoyable. But water is usually the place where I ask people to start most. And the other one is a really simple one, and it's easy for a lot of folks to ensure, which is simply buy less, and specifically buy less things wrapped in plastic. If you have an option for buying something, buy fruit from Safeway if it's wrapped in a plastic bag versus getting that same fruit on the loose bin or getting it at the farmer's market. There are easy ways for you to actually choose to avoid single-use disposable plastics, which do not get recycled in California, to get rid of those things in your life. And when you start paying attention to this, you'll find there's a huge number of opportunities for you to do it across a number of different products within there. It's one that I think the economy is widely based around plastics, and it's an area where I think we can all have a big impact if we consciously make those decisions.
Absolutely. So I want to go a little bit further back in your presentation and ask you about your scooters and the things that you're doing to encourage people to not drive. Has that had a measurable impact on cars on the road or traffic?
It did before the pandemic. Unfortunately, COVID took a lot of things away from us in urban life, not only our connections and for a lot of people, educational opportunities and many more. It also drained a lot of the downtown core areas of the populations that were using these. So we've actually seen, we saw a lot of success in 2018 and 2019 for scooter and bike share programs. And we're just starting to see those things recover now as more people are coming back to work within the offices in the urban cores. But the number of people in the cores in places like Oakland and San Francisco and San Jose, and even Los Angeles are still down pretty significantly. And one of the big things that's affected that is transit ridership and use of these alternative modes of transportation, things like scooters and bikes. So unfortunately, they're starting to trend forward, but they came way down as a result of the pandemic. And most transit providers are still struggling to get back to that level that they were at in 2019 when things started to shut down. I think you've seen a lot of coverage in the Bay Area, things like BART still operating at very, very low ridership levels. So unfortunately, this is one where I think we're going to have to rethink our strategies about this because we simply don't know how to plan for the future of these downtown cores, because people may not return to the office spaces and the levels they did before. And we may have to start looking at alternative uses for some of those commercial spaces. Things like housing are a great example. We have these buildings that could be retrofitted for housing and definitely could be creatively used for addressing the homelessness crisis. I think we're going to start to look at more strategic opportunities for those, not only to bring people into these cores of the city, but also to expand services for some of the bigger social priorities like homelessness.
Do you find that parks are an essential part of your plan?
They are, and never in the ways that we imagine. Parks are a great place for locating electric vehicle chargers because people are in them for an hour or two at a time. So it can be a great place to rest with people on pass-through trips. It's also a place where homeless encampments naturally occur in a lot of cities because the parks have the most open space and access to water. And so a lot of cities are struggling with whether the parks should stay open for the recreational uses that they were designed for or be used as the site for the encampments. And parks, I think, are one of these areas where I mentioned urban water use. Well, parks are also a heavy consumer of urban water. So Oakland has definitely looked at eliminating a lot of grass areas from our parklands, particularly in the urban parks, and replacing those with more native drought-tolerant species that we can irrigate with drip systems. We've already banned the use of things like natural gas or diesel-powered landscape equipment within those to make them quieter when we maintain them. But there's a lot of opportunity, I think, for advancing in parks. But parks are one of those areas that I don't think a lot of people understand just how valuable the parks are at the neighborhood level for frontline community. In a place like Oakland, for those familiar with our geography, we have about 9 miles of frontage on San Francisco Bay, and we have a primarily industrial and lower income flatland adjacent to very wooded hillside areas. The hillsides are where our most affluent community residents live, and we have about 50% tree canopy coverage in those hillside areas. About 50% of the land is shaded by a tree canopy. It's lovely, it's bucolic, it's wonderful, and it compares to 4% tree canopy coverage in our flatlands, which gives you an idea of the lived experience difference between lower income residents and upper income residents, between whether you live in tree-lined bucolic streets with views of San Francisco, or whether you live in flatland communities where there's very little shade shelter. It's despite the fact that it's only weather-wise, it should only be about 3 degrees warmer. It's actually about 7 to 10 degrees warmer because of urban heat island effect, because of all the concrete and the lack of shading. And the parks themselves often are seen as the biggest differentiator between people in the community about what they believe the hillside areas have that they lack. So it's one that residents have identified very specifically as one of the inequities that we need to address most.
I've read studies that say that cityscapes with more trees or that add trees have lower crime.
Yes, there's an entire sector. There's a principle called CPTED, Crime Prevention Through Environmental Design, CPTED. And this is a principle that police and city planners use together to design landscapes specifically around reducing crime rates. And yes, there's a lot of good data to support this contention that through tree plantings and other forms of streetscape improvements that you can actually reduce crime rates. And it's got a lot of good documented success.
I'm glad to hear it's being implemented. So we have a lot of questions in the chat. So I'm going to turn it over to Kevin to see if you'd like to share some of those questions with you.
Yeah, thank you, Daniel. That was a great presentation. Learn a lot. We have several questions here. First one I will bring out to you is from Anna Dodson. She said, you mentioned the disconnect from the private and public sector when it comes to data and making informed decisions. Is there a way we in the private sector could support local decision-making and optimize green policy via data access strategies or strategic partnership?
Yes, 1,000 times yes. I think there are a couple of different things that come to mind immediately when you say this. One is that we've had several versions of hackathons dealing with our data where we ask community businesses to come in and help us look at our data, better parse it out. We've seen this in a couple of key areas, not just the green stuff, but policing data is a wonderful example of this. Crime is a big concern in Oakland. It's a city with relatively high violent crime rates, and something that gets a national reputation for that, even though it varies really widely depending on where you are within the city, within this. And we get roughly 3,000 to 4,000 requests for public access to the data for police systems. And we have many, many non-sworn officers that spend their entire days just trying to get data into the hands of the people who want to see it, into the advocates for this, into the governmental agencies, into the private companies who need and want to use the data within there. I think, and there is somewhere we actually have relatively good data because the police document virtually everything that they do within this. In climate change, I think that the data sets are really disparate, and we in the city government don't actually have a good understanding of what we know and what we don't know. I provided our curb model from 2016 into 2018, and I can tell you the number of assumptions we had to put into it because we just simply didn't have good data sets on what our building stock looked like. We don't know where there are heat pump water heaters or gas tanked heat water heaters within there because people don't actually apply for permits when they put them in the homes, which is the normal way that you would know the data for this. I think there's a lot of examples of this when it comes to climate justice solutions. I think there are data sets out there that the private sector has knowledge of, and being able to bring those to us and help us understand not only how we access them, but how we use them effectively, especially for companies that have really good practices around using data-driven decision-making. I think there's a lot of potential. So if there are folks on the call today that have ideas in this, please do reach out to me, because it's an area where I feel like we're woefully behind and we could definitely benefit from the expertise and perspective of those in the private sector. And I'm happy to connect you to whatever city you happen to be located in, if it's not an Oakland specific solution, because I think I can speak pretty confidently for my fellow city representatives that we all feel like we struggle with this.
Yeah, thank you. Next question is from our own Catherine. How much can the city influence activities and policies in the port? what policy has the city imposed or attempt to impose?
That is a complicated question, Catherine. The legal structure of the Port of Oakland is a little bit different than a lot of ports. So the Port of Oakland is legally a department of the City of Oakland government. That said, it is functionally autonomous, meaning it has a board of commissioners that are appointed by the Oakland mayor, but they can independently make decisions that they feel are appropriate for the port. So there is influence in that the mayor makes appointments to the commission, and city staff and leadership can make advocacy positions to the port, but otherwise the port maintains its autonomy in deciding for itself where it should go. In things like climate, the city has its own climate plan that is very different from the ports, and they specifically don't really align on a fair number of air quality issues or maybe focus areas. So within there, it really is, I would say, an issue of relationship building. So in cases where we have shared desires and needs, we often find opportunities to collaborate. In areas where those don't necessarily overlap, sometimes we butt heads. And I think this is an unfortunate part of the way Oakland works in this, is that we're not all aligned around the same goals for environmental justice and climate equity. And I think that we could be. There are a lot of advocates within the areas around the port that are pushing for this. And I think the port is moving in that direction. I would say from our city perspective, we feel like there needs to be faster movement. But at the same time, the port runs an extremely busy airport and container vessel port, and the decisions they have to make really have to include a lot of the business considerations for the operators and users of those port facilities that they understand much better than we do. So I don't want to suggest that I'm always right or that my perspective is necessarily better in there, but I can tell you that them responding specifically to port business versus us looking at the community as a whole sometimes leads to mutually supportive outcomes and sometimes doesn't. But the city has pushed for a lot of proposed changes to how the port operates, and some of those have been realized and some have not. So I'd say it's a mixed bag in terms of outcomes.
Yeah, my furniture is still stuck on a boat, I think, somewhere in the ocean coming to Oakland. Next question is actually from me. How much is the Oakland's policy aligned with the state policy in the way that you benefit from the state policy? Also, some of them state policies lacking behind.
I think I will go back to the Nike commercials of the 90s and say, anything they can do, we can do better. It's our general attitude towards the state. If the state has a goal of carbon neutrality by 2045, we do it by 2040. If they think they can get all passenger vehicles to be electric by 2035, we aim for 2030. We always try to be more ambitious than the state on our targets for greenhouse gas reductions and climate equity, because of the way I started this in saying that we generally perceive ourselves as the innovators within government. It's innovators within government, so it's not quite like the private sector. We're slower than most in this, but we're certainly faster than the state and the federal government. We believe we can push harder, make more decisions that may work, may not. We may fail forward. We may learn some lessons from the efforts that apply forward and can help others. But states and federal governments need examples of what's working and what's not and why. And cities are very much trying to provide that. So we're in line with the state about the needed outcomes. Where we differ is on the timelines. Our elected leaders are always pushing to go further and go faster than the state, not just as an effort of priority, but also as a leadership tool to help demonstrate to the state what can be done so that some of the less progressive areas of our state can be shown what success might look like, or where the challenges are that they can address before it gets into state law.
Good. So does the state hold each city and municipalities accountable towards the reduce greenhouse gas? Are there like measures that you have to follow?
There is virtually no accountability in the greenhouse gas world anywhere in the globe. And this is one of the sad things about climate change. There are ambitious targets and goals set out, but you will not see penalties set out there in many sectors for this. California operates its private sector under a system called cap and trade. And this system does set caps for pollution for different industries and creates a credit market, which has an active sale of those that things like refineries have to buy in order to continue to operate within those. So there is an accountability mechanism for private corporations to a certain extent, but the degree to which that system is tied to overall state reductions in climate or the individual cities supporting efforts that make that marketplace operate most efficiently, none of those exist. So this is one of the areas of climate that I encourage all of you listening to maintain a healthy skepticism on when you see companies making claims about their role in benefiting the climate, or when you see city governments or state governments saying the same thing. The proof is really in the actions that follow from those. None of us have an accountability mechanism that will keep us from greenwashing. And so I think it's really up to everybody to maintain some skepticism when hearing these things and to demonstrate where the proof is, especially in measuring your progress over time and increasing actions when they don't meet up.
Very good, very good. Thank you. Yeah, this is something I always think, they should set not just a goal, but also there's accountabilities. Just like for the water wasters, many counties imposing the fines, which is very good. And this should apply towards greenhouse gas. You have to buy the carbon credit, otherwise you pay. So anyway, very good, Daniel. I have a next question coming from Allison Tom. Here it goes. You mentioned that recycling rates went up when Oakland implemented a one bin program. But how effective is the recycling program? There are always stories on the news about how recycling ends up in the landfill. So as an Oakland resident, I want to know, is my recycling, actually my building's recycling, actually being diverted from landfill?
Mm-hmm. It's a great question, Allison, and you're spot on in picking up and asking that. So thank you for posing the question there. I think that it's important for everybody to understand something that happened about 3 years ago. Up until about 3 years ago, virtually all of the cities in the United States did the same thing with their recycling, which is it ended up on train cars coming out to the West Coast and ended up either in the Port of Long Beach or the Port of Oakland, and it went on the container ships and headed right over to China. And we handed all of it to them and said, thank you very much for dealing with all of our recycling. And we took credit for it all being recycled if it ever made it onto a ship. We didn't actually track what happened once it got off that ship in China. And the sad truth of it is that a lot of the products that we thought were being recycled were in fact not being recycled. Now, 3 years ago, China changed their policy through something colloquial called National Sword. Now, don't ask me why it's called National Sword. I don't know what it has to do with swords, but China and a few other areas around it changed their standard for accepting recyclables and eliminated a great percentage of the United States from eligibility, given the quality of the recycling that we sent to them. So all the things that were being thrown in the carts, which had often food waste mixed in with them or weren't recyclable in nature, or people throwing yard clippings in the recycling container, all these things that happened in there were creating contamination such that China would no longer accept them. So we have to get our contamination rate below 1%. So 99% of what's in the bin has to be recyclable for them to accept it. We hit that standard almost never in any American city. So it's changed the marketplace. We now use countries like Thailand and Vietnam and Laos and the Philippines for a lot of the things that we used to use China for in there. We're still exporting it for the most part, but we are no longer including things that those other companies won't take, other countries won't take. So a great example of this is plastics. All of the things that have those nice little triangles on them and the number 1 through 7 in there somewhere, very, very little of that is actually being recycled. So if your question is, how much of my, my commercial buildings recycling is being recycled, my answer back to you is it depends on how much plastic you're throwing in it. Because if it's filled with things like paper products and metals and glasses, it's actually being fairly well recycled. All of those materials are sorted out. Every one of them has an active market and a place to go. The plastics we're really struggling with, that's what's going to landfill. And there's not a lot of hope that that's going to change soon, simply because of how cheap it is to manufacture new plastics. It just makes private companies not willing to invest in the equipment necessary to melt down and reuse plastics in an effective way. So this is the reality of that marketplace. And unfortunately, it's made a lot of time from people like me across cities to focus more on not buying plastic in the first place, or reusing every bit of plastic you have. Don't throw the bags you get in there, reuse them over and over as many times as you can. Use them for art projects, use them for whatever, but keep them out of the bins, because ultimately there's just not a recycling option for anything that can't be directly reused, like a hard plastic bottle that can be reused by the same company that generated it.
Daniel, thank you. Do you think most of cities are in the same boat in terms of recycling plastic?
Yes. There are a couple of local markets set up for particular products. If you have a manufacturer that uses a particular material, I'll give you an example here in Oakland. We have a very heavy industrial base where we did a lot of foundry work. So we would take scrap metals and actually melt them down on site to be remade into fencing, into pipes for plumbing, into a number of different things. If you've got a specialty use like that, often there is a local market for recyclables. But other than that, it tends to be national and international in basis. So most cities are struggling with this the same way that I just described.
Good. Kate has a question. Has Oakland banned single-use plastic bags?
We have banned single-use plastic bags for a lot of businesses, but this is one of the areas where I think a lot of folks will probably shake their heads at government. We have a lot of local laws that we passed, and this is true for San Francisco and LA and San Jose and Sacramento and most of the big cities. We passed them, but there's not really an enforcement mechanism for it. The only way we find out when people are still using the plastic bags within our area is when they're reported by somebody. And even then, we don't have an enforcement team just waiting to go out and be the plastic bag police for this. We send letters, we can find them over time if they continue to do this, but there's not really an enforcement mechanism other than customers speaking to the stores where you see them there and saying that they won't shop there if they continue to do this. It's an area where the legislation is there, but the enforcement is not. And unfortunately, this is one where there continue to be good actors and bad actors in every city. And we've yet to find an effective way to get to the bad actors.
Good, good. One more question. I live in San Jose. Our city provides the water saving rebate program for the homeowners to replace their lawn with their drought-resistant landscape. Does Oakland have similar program?
We're not the water provider for our residents. It's East Bay Municipal Utility District, or East Bay MUD. They do provide similar incentives to San Jose for replacing grass there. And most of the water providers in the state now do this. But even that has not been enough. And some of the Southern California regulators, the water agencies, are now, you mentioned, Kevin, the fines that go out to people for water wasting. The fines haven't actually proven very effective at getting people to reduce water. They simply pay the fines and move on. So in Southern California, some of the agencies have started installing flow regulators at people's homes. So if you get enough fines on there, they won't fine you again. They will simply limit the amount of water pressure you get in your home such that your sprinklers won't work. And your shower will be a drip shower, whether you want it to be or not. And this gives you a sense of what's coming for being able to contain urban water use, because the tools we've used in the past just simply aren't effective enough at getting down water usage. The Colorado River, which supplies water to about half of the population in the Western United States, is under an order to cut 4 million acre feet in the next 60 days or face federal control of that water system, which would be a complete revamping of California's water laws. And this affects California, Arizona, Nevada, Colorado, Mexico, a lot of areas. So there's some pretty drastic changes coming in the water world. Like I said, we're pretty good here in the Bay Area by water use standards. So I don't think anybody here should feel terribly guilty, but know that there's some big changes on the horizon. And this is an area where we all need to find new ways to take action, because the alternative for this isn't simply a measured retreat from coastal areas, which are primarily wealthy homes anyway. This is an area where people stop having access to fresh drinking water in the areas that are at the end of the line, which is happening in the Central Valley. It's happening in Arizona. It's happening in Utah. It's happening in Mexico, and it's going to keep getting worse. So this has real effect on people's lives right now.
Yeah.
Well, I think that's the last
Kate,
question. Yes.
Do we have one more question? Time for one more question?
Okay, one more.
One more? Okay, so we have like a few minutes left. Catherine goes, regarding the eco block and the mini grid, is Oakland building a bigger grid that can handle solar and batteries?
So the grid for Oakland is not actually local at all. We are part of the Western grid, which is actually 7 states. It goes all the way from British Columbia down to Mexico and inland through Nevada and Arizona as well. So the grid, unfortunately, I mean, it's fortunate in that it helps us have fewer blackouts to have a grid that big, but it means that we can't really create many local versions of this. What we can do are support microgrids for people's homes and for areas called resilience hubs, which is where we're looking at libraries and community centers, houses of worship, places where people can go when we have these smoke days and power outages, where people can continue to get access to reliable power. That's more of the focus, is creating these in the frontline communities so that we've got more access. But luckily for the wealthier people, they can put batteries on their homes. And for everybody else, we're trying to make sure that the social buildings that serve as the safety net right now, that those are equipped with these forms of microgrids that keep the lights on.
Awesome. Kate, you can have the closing remarks.
Well, actually, I do want to thank you very much, Daniel, for everything you've said today. I know it was extremely interesting for all of us, but Catherine is actually going to say the closing remarks.
Hi, I'm Catherine. I'm a Tuck class of 2009, and I'm president of the Dartmouth Alumni Association of Silicon Valley. So thank you all for joining us today. I would also like to add my thanks to Daniel for sharing his thoughts regarding all the activities taking place in Oakland to make communities more sustainable. And thank you also to Kevin and Kate for moderating and for all your efforts in putting this together. If any of you have suggestions for events, are interested in helping us organize events or getting involved in the DASV, please let me know. Email us at info@daasv.org. We'd love to hear from you. So thank you all again. Have a great afternoon and have a very happy 4th of July holiday.